And Yet It Moves is an indie platformer with a unique visual style and a twist. You could put it in the same category as games like Braid or Fez, although it's certainly not a clone of either of those. The twist here is actually just that, a twist. The player must get from checkpoint to checkpoint by twisting the game world to alter its orientation, allowing him to get to new areas. The controls are your straightforward platformer controls. You can move, you can jump, but there are 3 additional inputs to rotate clockwise, counterclockwise, and a full 180 degrees. So walls that are too high to jump can quickly become ground to walk along. The levels are designed around this concept, and the visual indicators as to which direction is the ground will often shift with the flow of the puzzles. This means that there isn't one true bottom or top to any given level, which prevents you from feeling like you're walking along a ceiling or a wall most of the time. Gravity always pulls towards the bottom of the screen, but the player character's momentum is maintained after rotating the game world. This means that by rotating at the correct times, you can survive falls or jumps that would otherwise kill you. You can also use the momentum gained from falling to propel yourself across areas where simply rotating the world isn't enough to get you there. As the game progresses, the puzzles and levels take advantage of this to varying degrees. The world of Yet It Moves is constructed to resemble a collage. The player character is made out of pieces of ripped up paper and is reunited with a character-sized hole in a sheet of paper to complete each level. The backgrounds and environments are mostly pictures of things that they are meant to represent. So a tree has pictures of bark forming the limbs and pictures of leaves for foliage. Similar to the player character, these images have a ripped look to them, as if we're playing through a sort of live-action collage. Just as the visuals have a rough, handmade quality to them, the sound design strongly features sound effects that have a low-budget feel to them. Most of the sound effects sound as if someone just made the sound that they wanted with their mouth and left it at that. It's like a small child making explosion sounds when smashing their toys together. This isn't a complaint on my part, as I felt that lends itself well to the world of the game. According to the official website, all of the sound effects and music at least start from one of the designer's voices. It's not all just him making sounds, and there are some noises with a distinctly electronic feel at times, but it all comes together to have an analog effect in the end. Ambient noises and music come and go depending on where you're at in the level. As the game progresses and the puzzle elements become more complex and sometimes abstract, the world of the game changes with them. At these points, levels consist of far fewer clear indications of real-world things, like trees or caves, and become much more about shapes and colors. Some of the latter stages are downright trippy in this aspect. At the same time that this is happening, the level design stops worrying about having a direct connection between different checkpoints, and will often alter the screen completely to open up the next puzzle. At these points, the end of the areas are often on the same screen, so no scrolling is required, giving the puzzles a much more contained feel compared to the organic flow of the earlier areas. Though this does halt the flow of the game a bit, I found these areas and puzzles enjoyable in their own right, and you're not buried in them so much that you feel like you're playing a different game entirely. The music really stood out for me in some parts of the later levels. There are a few sections where platforms appear and disappear in time with the music in a way that made what could have been very frustrating to fail at an enjoyable area to repeat. I mentioned earlier how the player character is made of paper, and each level ends with it joining a larger piece of paper. That's actually the extent of the plot. And Yet It Moves makes no effort to have a story, even in a vague sense, as if there's something happening in the setting of the game that it just doesn't focus on. That's not to say that there's no narrative, however, as the levels do have a progression to them, and the various visual styles fit together well. So, what keeps you invested in continuing the experience if there's no story being told? The answer here is mood, and plenty of it. Mood is what really ties this together. The ambient noises and music, as well as the shifting visuals, create a tone that is maintained well throughout the whole game. If the style remained completely static as the levels and puzzles got harder or more complex, the game would start to feel stale after a while. As it is, the first time I played And Yet It Moves, I picked up the controller and didn't put it down until I beat the game. Even as I was replaying some of it in preparation for this review, I found that I'd played through the majority of the game having lost track of time. I've talked a lot about what I like about this game, so now it's time to talk about some of the problems. For starters, the campaign is really short. The whole game can be beaten in just a few hours. I also lost where I was going several times. The fact that there's no ceiling or floor or anything is oftentimes really good, but can sometimes mean that you end up going the wrong direction. They try and compensate for this by having your markers point towards where the next checkpoint is going to be, which helps, but sometimes in some of the more complicated levels, you end up getting turned around and end back up at the same checkpoint you just left. I also felt that some puzzles break the flow or pacing of the game. Since the majority of the game isn't a strict sequence of puzzles or rooms that must be beaten in order to get to the next, when the breaks between puzzles become more blatant, it has the effect of pulling you out of the mood that most levels establish well. There is a certain amount of replayability here. There are speed runs you can go back through and speed run different levels. I personally didn't get much out of that. I felt that the experience of the game worked well enough on its own, and I didn't really feel like going back through and doing all those. But if that's your kind of thing, you can probably get a little bit more time out of this game. So in closing, I would say my rating for this is probably 4 out of 5 on some arbitrary scale. Basically, I recommend this game. It's not perfect, but it's worth your time. It's not particularly long, and I think if you look at that as a positive rather than a negative, like I was looking at it earlier, I think that you can really enjoy this game. It's available on Steam. I believe there's still a playable demo out there. There's also a WiiWare version that has its own unique Wii controls, but I can't really talk to that specifically since I haven't played the Wii version myself, but that's something that might be worth checking out. Alright guys, thanks, bye.